Everybody agrees that independent courts and tribunals are fundamental for a healthy democracy. But just how much independence they should have, that's debatable. Some are in favor of radical rule of law. Others don't even believe in that idea at all. Is there a compromise to be reached? Stay with me to find out, here on Wider View. And I'm your host, Mateusz Mazzini. Good evening. Our main story tonight touches upon perhaps the single most pressing issue in modern democracies: the role of the judiciary. In theory, judges and prosecutors constitute a separate, fully independent branch of democratic power, and they should be able to hold politicians accountable. But in practical terms, this is often neither possible nor desirable. In various political systems, judges are appointed by elected officials or run for office themselves. Yet they are always accused of being too political. But the debate over the role of the judiciary in democracy extends far beyond the courts themselves. Many European countries are now facing a tough dilemma. Should they ban far-right extremist parties? And should they do it now, at the height of their popularity? Often, the decision will have to be made by judges who will reference the principle of the rule of law. But at the same time, they need to take into account how many people feel represented by these parties, and whose views cannot be banned. Will democracy survive the crisis of the judiciary? We map out the landscape of this issue in our report.
In early May of 2025, the German Office for the Protection of the Constitution released its long-awaited report on Alternative for Germany, or AfD. The agency labeled the party as extremist and incompatible with the federal constitution of Germany. The conclusions of the study would suffice to usher in procedures to delegalize it permanently, especially given the fact that provisions to ban parties seen as anti-democratic have existed in the German law since the post-war years. But banning AfD could have disastrous consequences. The party is now polling at 26% and is the most popular political group in the country. Deeming it unfit to take part in elections could further undermine trust in the judiciary. Globally, this trend is almost omnipresent. More countries witness erosions of the independence of the courts than improvements in this area. Even the United States, where judges enjoy a high social status and institutional protection from political pressure, suffer from these issues. Trust in judges and prosecutors is falling sharply, as people see them merely as political appointees. This, in turn, benefits populist politicians who never believed in independent courts in the first place. In a world of complete partisanship, it's a normal idea that someone controls the courts. So, when populists take them over, it's not a violation of any norm. Liberal politicians keep making attempts to reverse that trend. But it is proving difficult, if not impossible. Expectations are high, but some voters demand retribution, which often requires the courts to stay political, just with a different affiliation. For courts to remain independent, they need to be able to criticize everyone, especially those in power.
Will the rule of law forever divide European nations? Can courts fight their politicization? And is banning political opponents a strategy of protecting the rules or bending them? These are the most fundamental questions for our democracies right now. So let's tackle them with the help of our guests. Joining me tonight are Nina dos Santos, former Europe editor at CNN, and Anna Wójcik, associate professor at Koźmiński University in Warsaw. Good evening both, and welcome to Wider View.
Good evening.
Anna, I wanted to start with you and open up the debate with the basics. I know this might not be the easiest question to answer, especially at the beginning of our conversation, but it very much seems the case that the entire political dispute in Europe revolves around the rule of law. But what is the rule of law exactly?
Well, the rule of law means that there are constraints on the exercise of power of various branches of government, the checks and balances, and that authority is bound by law and cannot act unconstrained. In the European Union, the rule of law is part of a common tradition of member states, and also this is a fundamental value of the Union, which is protected in Article 2 of the EU Treaty. So both the EU institutions and member states are obliged to respect Article 2. And the EU is not only an internal market, but also this is an area of justice and freedom, and it relies on mutual trust between member states. And in practical terms, we need courts in member states to trust courts in other member states. Without that, the EU legal system would collapse.
This is a very important element of our discussion, and I wanted to follow up on that with you, Nina, because you, Anna, mentioned precisely here the essence, the relationship between the European courts and the member states' judiciary. But before I ask my question, Nina, I wanted to hear, or let us hear from Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, who has a very defined and strong view on what the rule of law is.
When joining the European Union, the Polish people put their trust in the European Union. They expected the European Union to defend their rights, and rightly so. The Commission is the guardian of the treaty. It is my Commission's duty to protect the rights of EU citizens wherever they live in our Union.
This was Ursula von der Leyen obviously speaking with regards to the Polish violations of the rule of law a couple of years ago. There seems to be a very popular argument among some of the European politicians that the European Commission only ever gets involved in issues touching upon the rule of law when it suits Brussels. Should the European Commission really have that competence, Nina?
Well, the problem that Brussels has essentially is that they want countries who are inside the European Union to want to be part of the EU and to share common values and common interpretations over what the rule of law is. But sometimes laws of individual countries and their quote unquote competencies actually abut and, hit head on the wish of the European Union to have the right to, for its terms, as you could hear there, dictate their rules, values, and what they believe their interpretation of the rule of law and its strategic direction of a country should be if it wants to remain part of the European Union. And as you pointed out, Poland has been the bête noire, if you like, on this issue for many years for the EU, predating Ursula von der Leyen's time at her first mandate at the European Commission, and now she's well into her second. Back in 2017, the EU issued a very strong rebuke towards Poland when the ruling Law and Justice Party was ruling at that time. You could see her looking at the outgoing president of the ruling Law and Justice linked president, Andrzej Duda, there when she was making these comments a few years ago, rebuking Poland on Brussels' perceptions that it had backtracked on the rule of law. The real problem for Brussels, though, is that Poland is a very big and significant member of the European Union, and it's not as if Poland can be kicked out because Brussels doesn't like what it's doing vis-à-vis the rule of law.
This seems to be, at least, a debate that one way or another will revolve around Poland. So on that note, since we've already touched upon the elephant in the room here, Anna, back to you. Let's talk restoration of the rule of law, because we all remember back in 2023, the current Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, campaigned very much on the promise of restoring the rule of law without maybe necessarily defining what that stands for in practical terms. A year and a half into his term as Prime Minister, we have a number of different legal experts, judges, former judges, who are very much disappointed with how that process is going. And my question to you, Anna, again, a bit of a philosophical one, I guess. Can rule of law actually be restored in a normal, ongoing, democratic competition when you have to take into account the fact that sooner or later, or maybe sooner than later, you might actually lose the upcoming election?
Well, so the rule of law repair is a process that involves both solving the constitutional puzzle, the constitutional crisis in which Poland has been embroiled since 2015, so 10 years now. And on the other hand, it also means the increasing effectiveness of judiciary. So actually creating a real reform that the previous government was arguing that it has implemented, but in fact we have seen that proceedings take longer and longer. And when it comes to the repair, of course, the process of the rule of law repair is constrained by politics, and the fact that we will have a cohabitation between Donald Tusk's government and future President Nawrocki does not fare well for fast, speedy repair in constitutional terms, because Mr. Nawrocki, formerly independent, has been supported by the formerly governing Poland, the Law and Justice Party, the PiS party, which will, of course, want to preserve its heritage in the court changes.
So a quick follow-up question to you, Anna. How important should international courts and tribunals be in the process of restoration of the rule of law? Should that be an exclusive process that takes place within the member states? So in other words, Poles and Poles only? Or should we see international players anyhow getting involved in this?
Definitely, Poland is part of all EU and Council of Europe mechanisms, and it needs to also implement the rulings of the European Court of Human Rights and the EU Court of Justice. However, it has a certain leeway in how it implements the reforms, because those rulings do not say precisely what should be done. And there are also other bodies of the European system, such as the Vance Commission, which is an expert body of the Council of Europe that advises governments which would like to implement reforms, including the reforms of the judiciary. So the Polish endeavor should be a European and transnational one, because it touches upon the most important question of the whole European legal system, which is the mutual trust that member states respect the rule of law. And Poland is also this test case for actually being able to restore it after many years of demise. So a lot of attention is on Poland at the moment. It will continue to be in the near future.
The Polish endeavor should be part of a European one. It's a beautiful sentence. I'm not entirely sure that a lot of Polish politicians would actually subscribe to that, but let's history develop itself in the future. On that note, Nina, over to you, and let's move away from Europe for a bit, because we saw in our opening report that there is a eroding, declining trust in judiciary mechanism and judicial institutions, also in the United States. And now, in addition, we have an administration that disregards the rule of law kind of by definition. And to prove the point here, let's hear from Vice President J.D. Vance speaking about rule of law himself.
I think that what Trump should do, like if I was giving him one piece of advice, fire every single mid-level bureaucrat, every civil servant in the administrative state, replace them with our people. And when the courts, because you will get taken to court, and then when the courts stop you, stand before the country like Andrew Jackson did and say the Chief Justice has made his ruling, now let him enforce it.
I think these words don't actually require any commentary on behalf of anyone. So a question to you, Nina. Do you think that the American judiciary is facing an existential risk of becoming or being made redundant, irrelevant, because the executive branch will just bypass it every single time?
I think there's a real risk in the United States that, and many of us on this side of the Atlantic will find this ironic because the US is one of the most litigious societies in the world, that its judiciary is coming under a huge amount of political pressure. Now, if you're in a country like the UK, where I am, there has been some, some discussion over previous Conservative governments as to whether or not the judiciary in a place like the UK, which, by the way, has the head of state in the form of the king, should be politicized. And when we look at what happens over in the United States, everybody steps back from the brink and goes, oh, no, we don't want politicization of the judiciary, because this is exactly where it leads us. You obviously have a very, very complicated set of arrangements between federal courts, state courts, and various elements of the judiciary that Donald Trump is able to. And people like J.D. Vance, that clip, I presume, was before he became vice president, because he can now say exactly what he was saying in your clip before, Mateusz, directly to the US president, and it seems as though he has decided to do exactly what he says. They can, enact this vision that they have of trying to gain closer and closer control over the judiciary. One thing I would say is I'm not entirely sure whether the game plan is to make the judiciary redundant in America, or really whether it's a question of trying to challenge it, to pit it against the people in the United States themselves. But many people outside America are extremely worried about the precedent that this sets, not just for America, but for the rest of the world.
But following up on that and staying with you, Nina, if the plan really was to put the judiciary against the people, or the people against the judiciary, what purpose would that serve?
Personal enrichment, maybe, being able to avoid being impeached or suffer any consequences from that. If you have, a president in the future or now who may want to do something that, let's call it wacky, they may not have to face the consequences of that. Look, this isn't just an issue for America. Autocracy is on the rise all over the world. We've got various leaders in places like Turkey that have faced, allegations that they may have to face one day in court. Israel as well, with Benjamin Netanyahu. I could go on. Years ago, I used to cover Silvio Berlusconi's governments and his endless allegations of corruption trials that he went through when he was Prime Minister of Italy. So, the reality is that lots of powerful politicians do face legal woes during their office and after their office. And if you're Donald Trump, the US president, you faced it in the interim as well. So all of this continues to challenge the judiciary in America and elsewhere. And if you speak to many Americans, they will often say, well, look, I have full confidence in our judiciary. It is the other branch of government. It will stand firm. But many people also are getting increasingly worried that it might buckle under the weight of politicization. Well, even if it wants to stay firm itself, we all know that the judiciary doesn't have the power, doesn't have the tools to defend itself, because the rule will not enforce itself. But you, Nina, mentioned something fundamentally important, which is the problem of perhaps banning or delegitimizing certain political opponents and excluding them from, rightly or wrongly, the democratic process. And on that note, I wanted to move to you, Anna, and ask about another aspect of the court's actions, which is precisely that, the debate over to ban or not to ban, to allow participation or not to allow. And we see right now on the screen a very important piece of data just recently from Germany. 48% of Germans, according to a survey from May 2025, support a total ban or delegitimization of Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, which is now, as we've heard, the single most popular political party in Germany. And Anna, question to you, should courts enforce these bans, even if we know we do have regulations that allow for it, but it also is the case of the single most popular party in Germany?
Well, this is a German invention. So the idea of militant democracy, most European democracies on the continent are actually militant democracies, which means that they have some instruments, mechanisms that should protect democracy from within, from those who want to dismantle it from inside. And this includes these mechanisms allowing, in exceptional circumstances, to ban political parties. However, the burden of proof in such cases is very high. And in the cited German case, like historically, only two parties have been banned, the Communist Party of Germany and the Socialist Reich Party. So currently, of course, we shouldn't look only at opinion polls to determine whether a party should be banned or not. In the legalistic formal sense. The judges should look at the proofs. And I believe that, of course, in this case, judges will also take into account the fact that the party, there have been attempts for many years. And it seems that the narrative of the AfD is trying to go more mainstream. However, there are also those fringe sections that seem to be advocating for a state that is illiberal, and we can discuss to what extent this is the dismantling of democracy, what they have in their program, or the program that is more or less openly discussed or hidden. So this is always a very difficult question, a question for judges, and I believe that the national German system should have a proper discussion. And of course, it's not part of Polish lawyers to discuss whether they should ban a party or not.
You're probably right on the money to say that Polish legal experts should perhaps not discuss German inventions when it comes to judiciary. But Nina, over to you with a similar question. A very similar case took place just recently in France. Obviously, allegations different, but the outcome sociologically comparable, let's put it that way. Marine Le Pen, for now at least, being banned from running for president. But banning radical parties for many different reasons obviously doesn't solve the problem or doesn't eliminate the phenomenon that so many people still support them. How is democracy supposed to fight that problem if there is a growing part of the electorate that still openly displays these kinds of views?
I think the situations in France, Germany, and also Romania, we should talk about, are very, very different. So take, for instance, Romania, where you had, as you said, a fringe candidate that appeared to come from nowhere, boosted by all these unknown Twitter or TikTok bots, and then people intervened, the courts intervened, banned that candidate. And then eventually Romania, in a nail-biting presidential election, plumped for the Liberal candidate. Who'd have thought? In Germany, we've got a more serious situation further down the line where the intelligence agencies now have deemed the AfD a potential risk to democracy and essentially have the right to surveil them. And that can create a much, much longer problem down the line. In France, it's a bit different because the Le Pen family, whether it's Marine Le Pen or her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, have actually been sort of more or less omnipresent on the political scene, albeit on the fringe, gaining more ground right throughout the course of my lifetime. And I spent a lot of time in France and was educated in France. And they're doing exactly what, as Anna was just saying before, the AfD is doing, trying to migrate to the mainstream. But the big concern here is whether or not Marine Le Pen, concerned for her party, will actually be able to run in the 2027 presidential election with Jordan Bardella, who you can see there, her deputy, as her wingman, but in a more junior position because the French courts appear to have temporarily blocked her pending her appeal on some embezzlement charges. Now, if she still continues to try and run, and this is causing friction between her and Jordan Bardella, her deputy, it'll be really, really close to the line in 2027 before the courts will actually make a decision as to whether or not she can be eligible to finally, mount that appeal and actually run. So I think what's different in France is that the Le Pens have always been on the stage here. They have gradually, created all of that support, and now is their kind of moment. I think it's different with the AfD and other fringe parties in other parts of Europe because they have sort of seemingly come out of nowhere in a much shorter period of time. What is similar, though, is that clearly these parties are capturing up to a third of the vote because there's something that modern mainstream parties is not answering among the electorate.
There is a lot to be discussed and fixed, I guess, in terms of how our democracies are working, but there seems to be a consensus emerging from our discussion tonight that excluding more and more parts of the electorate will not solve our problems because these people were not the problem in the first place. Interesting times ahead for European and American and any other democracy on the planet, which means we'll be coming back to revisit the topic in our further episodes. Nina dos Santos and Anna Wójcik were our guests tonight. Thank you very much. Believe it or not, judges can be independent. But in order to achieve that, they need to enjoy institutional protection and broad societal support. They are the last line of defense for the legal order. And rules will not enforce themselves. Only people can do it. Thank you for being with us tonight. Next week, we will take a look into the future and try to predict if artificial intelligence will take over politics. Make sure you're with us next Thursday, follow us on YouTube, and have a good evening.